Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come all you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
전체의 사회주의를 우리 어떻게 정대로 지키는가를 세계여보라. 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 국민 백성의 영도 따라서 선군의 붉은 기 그 신념으로 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 조체의 강중대국을 우리 어떻게 이 땅에 세우는가를 세계여보라. 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 장군님의 뜻을 받들어 붉은의 정신력 그대 장으로 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 조선 결심하면 한다. 조선 한다면 한다. Ягод негнал тим терек
Ялтин дорогой те боцима, Аланчини очкисем, Алачимин очкисем, Неште буни зостеховум перичи,
Le Vietnam brûle et moi je hurle Mao, Mao. Johnson rigole et moi je vole Mao, Mao. Le napalm coule et moi je roule Mao, Mao. Les villes crèvent et moi je rêve Mao, Mao. Les putains crient et moi je ris Mao, Mao. Le riz est fou et moi je joue Mao, Mao. L'impérialisme dicte partout sa loi. La révolution n'est pas un dîner. La bomba est un tigre en papier. Les masses sont les véritables héros. Les ricains tuent et moi je mue Mao Mao. Les fous sont rois et moi je bois Mao Mao. Les bombes tonnent et moi je sonne Mao Mao. Les bébés fuient et moi je fuis Mao Mao. Les Russes mangent et moi je danse Mao Mao. Diable dénonce, je renonce Mao Mao.
C'est le petit livre rouge qui fait que tout enfin bouge.
La base de l'armée, c'est le soldat. Le vrai pouvoir est au bout du fusil. Les monstres seront tous anéantis. L'ennemi ne périt pas de lui-même. Mao Mao. Mao Mao. Mao Mao. Mao Mao.
When I was young, I used to be as fine a man as ever you'd see in the Prince of Wales. He said to me, come and join the British Army. Tooraloo, they're looking for monkeys up in the zoo. It says, one, if I had a face like you, I'd join the British Army. Sarah Conn and baked a cake, and so for poor old Slattery's sake, sure I threw myself into the lake, pretending I was barmy. Tooraloo, I've made me mind up what to do. Now I'll work me ticket home to you and the British Army. Sergeant Healy went away and his wife got in the family way, and the only words that she could say was blame the British Army. Tooraloo, me curse upon the Labour Blue that took me darling boy from me to join the British Army. Corporal Sheen is a terrible note, just give him a couple of jars of stout and he bait the enemy with his mouth and save the British Army. Tooraloo, I've made me mind up what to do. Now I'll work me ticket home to you and the British Army.
Ich trage eine Fahne und diese Fahne ist rot. Es ist die Arbeiterfahne, die Vater trug durch die Not. Die Fahne ist niemals gefallen, so oft auch der Träger fiel. Sie weht heute über uns allen und zieht schon der Sehnsucht Ziel. Ich trage eine Fahne, das Rot der Arbeiter macht. Es hat die Arbeiterfahne bei Nacht mein Vater bewacht und hat sie mir früh übergeben, als Morgenrot stieg empor, dass wir sie zur Sonne heben, bei Tag in der Kampfbeschwör. Ich trage eine Fahne und diese Fahne ist rot. Es ist die Arbeiterfahne, die uns die Einheit gebot. Sie hat unsere Väter begleitet durch Tage und Nacht und Krieg. Drum vorwärts die Söhne erstreitet, zu Ende den großen Sieg.
веселый раз. Ухнем, еще разик, веселый раз. Разовьем мы березу, разовьем мы кудряву. Ой, да-дай-да, ой, да-дай-да, разовьем мы кудряву. Утреннего в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весь летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы, будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы.
Продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. Ленин такой молодой, и юный отряд впереди. Ленин такой молодой, и юный отряд впереди.
С неба милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.
И он продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный отряд впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный отряд впереди. Не стой, снегопад, не ветер, богат. Заменю планеты, посетили твой отряд. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный отряд впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный отряд впереди. Продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный отряд впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный отряд впереди.
All of you here today in the hall to our book launch. Could someone bring me a copy of Hopal's TRL, actually? I meant to have one with me, but forgot. We have reproduced... Oh, perfect. It's fine. Our comrade here has done his homework. So essentially, I'm really sorry, there's been a slight hitch in our production line, and the physical copies of our new pamphlet are not yet in my hands. They'll be here in a week. Which is a slight mismatch, obviously, of timing, but we didn't think it was worth cancelling the book launch for such a small reason as that. Anybody can, of course, place pre-orders today, and we will get them sent out in the next week, 10 days. Our new pamphlet is called Trotskyism, Trotsky brackets ism, a tool of imperialism. And essentially what we've done is put together a collection which includes the preface, which is from this, what is really the Bible for understanding Trotskyism, the book written by our founding comrade Brar 30 years ago now, called Trotskyism or Leninism. Absolutely brilliant book. And for anybody who wants a real understanding of Trotskyism internationally and in Britain, this is the book you need. But Trotskyism, a tool of imperialism, our new pamphlet, puts together the fantastic preface from this book with a few other articles, one of which is an article we found ourselves forced to write this summer when a small and insignificant group of Trotskyists was suddenly rebranded and relaunched, not just in Britain but internationally, with a huge marketing budget, a very slick publicity campaign, and complete with a whole load of promotional mentioning in bourgeois media and even in the House of Parliament from bourgeois ministers. So suddenly the name of this group was on everybody's lips and being pushed in everybody's social media algorithms, and we felt the need to explain to people who they were and where they'd come from and what was the reason they were suddenly seeming to be everywhere. So there's an article about that party, which is, of course, the RCP, as they now call themselves, Revolutionary Communist Party. Not the first group of Trotskyites in Britain to have made use of that name, by the way, but just the most recent. So an article on them. There's also a fantastic article, which is, it's a review of Ken Loach's film, Land and Freedom, but in the process of reviewing what was a very Trotskyite counter-revolutionary narrative put forward by Ken Loach, a really good lesson in history of the Spanish Civil War is also given in the meantime. So that article is in there too. So essentially, it's and of course we also republished the brilliant article by Joseph Stalin called also Trotskyism or Leninism, which was written in 1924, delivered as a speech to some communist trade unionists in the Soviet Union at a time just after Lenin's death, when Trotsky was really coming out full throttle once again in his opposition to Leninism, this time cloaking it in defending Leninism against Stalinism, but essentially a continuation of the same politics he'd been following since 1903 of anti-Leninism. So that's the pamphlet we've put together. It will be in our hands, as I said, very, very shortly, and that's what we're here to talk to you about today. So I'm going to give you a little presentation, just a hopefully fairly succinct overview of some of the content of the pamphlet and why it matters. And then I'm going to pass over to our comrade Alex McKay here, who has had the dubious privilege of being inside a Trotskyite organization and being able to report to us on or substantiate some of the things we say from the outside about how the Trotskyites operate in Britain today and how that's a continuation of how Trotsky always behaved and what Trotskyism basically does for the ruling class, which is disrupt the working class's ability to organize independently. So, yeah, it's really interesting, actually, the re-emergence of the RCP recently. Came at a really interesting moment, because it really looked from the outside as if Trotskyism was dying a kind of a quiet death. You know, its main reason for having been kind of conjured into existence as a serious force in the West was anti-communism. And it was particularly targeted against the Soviet Union. That is, of course, why Stalin has always been its main kind of target. There's no Trotskyite group. You can get a million flavors of Trotskyite groups, but they all have one thing in common, and that is vehement hatred of Joseph Stalin, the person who led the building of socialism in the Soviet Union. So, of course, the USSR is no more, has been no more since 1991. A terrible catastrophe for the workers and oppressed peoples of the world, but something which the Trotskyites welcomed with open arms, exceptionally enthusiastically. But of course, it takes away one of their main raison d'etre, and also one of the main raison d'etre for the lavish funding they have enjoyed for a long time. Then, of course, we had the financial crisis of 2008. And with the combination of those two things, what we saw was very much a kind of diminution of the social democratic gravy train, which, of course, the gravy train being what all the social democrat careerists get fed from, right? It used to be a big thing in Britain, a big trough, feeding a lot of careers of all kinds of people in this country whose job is to stop the working class organising independently for their liberation, right? And some of them are in the Labour Party, but many of them are paid well to have careers outside the Labour Party, but their role fundamentally being to pull people back towards the Labour Party when they look as if they're starting to feel like maybe Labour's not the way that we get free as a class. After 2008, it was really noticeable that the kind of social democratic gravy train was getting smaller. There's fewer careers for people outside the Labour Party and in the Labour Party. You know, left Labour got smaller, and all the parties around Labour got smaller. The whole movement has been in decline for a long time. The organised trade union movement, the organised working class, all those organisations that the Labour Party was keeping a control on, either directly through its left-wing members or indirectly through revisionists of the CPB type or Trotskyites of the SWP type, all getting smaller. So the numbers of careers available for Trotskyites diminishing, and therefore splits and scandals proliferating in the ranks of Trotskyites, falling out with each other, essentially, over who gets to still have a career. That was my reading of it from the outside. And so what we saw was a whole stream of sex and corruption scandals coming out of various Trotskyite organizations. They're all splintering and fracturing. That, of course, is nothing new, splintering and fracturing. But, when you've already got smaller, splintering and fracturing means, you're getting smaller and smaller into kind of nothingness. It sort of looked like the Trotskyite movement had gone into terminal decline, and they didn't really have much of an audience left. And then suddenly, as I said earlier, this summer we saw a massive rebranding and relaunching of one particular branch of the Trotskyite movement that hadn't been terribly significant. In this country, they were known as Socialist Appeal, but they're part of an international network called the International Marxist Tendency. What was very interesting about the relaunching and rebranding of the IMT group of parties, who mainly operate in imperialist countries, but not solely. They operate in many countries where there's a bit of a middle class that can harbour a Trotskyite group. So you'll find in the big Latin American countries like Argentina, Brazil. I know my comrade in Brazil reported to me, in fact he asked me, have you heard of this RCP? I'm suddenly seeing he teaches in a university, I'm seeing their posters around. I said, yes, so are we. So it's a coordinated relaunch of the IMT group of Trotskyite parties, and a massive rebranding. What's interesting about the timing of this is, of course, as we all know, the ideas of communism and Marxism are suddenly once again becoming popular amongst the working classes in the imperialist countries. I mean, everywhere, but particularly, you're noticing it in the West, precisely because ever since since the defeat of the miners, the fall of the Soviet Union, but then particularly since the 2008 crisis, which of course followed the massive disillusionment of many people over the Iraq War. If you look at that train of events, if you look at the economic deterioration of the situation of the mass of poor British working people, combined with their political disillusionment with social democracy. Remember how excited people were? Are those of you old enough to remember when Tony Blair was getting elected? Everybody thought it was the end of all the terrible things of the Thatcher era. Very few people understood that Tony Blair was a continuation of Margaret Thatcher when it came to policy of the ruling class, that he was a tool of the ruling class in exactly the same way that Margaret Thatcher was, and that in fact he deepened and accelerated most of her policies. He didn't reverse a single one of them. But people had to learn that from bitter experience. And of course, by 2008, they had learned that. And then what we also had in 2008 was a massive lesson in how the ruling class lies to us about absolutely everything. And on this one, it was, of course, economics. Because up until 2008, the Labour Party had been pushing a narrative that said, we have to start tightening our belts, there's not enough money to go around, we have to start being careful with our budget, or the NHS is failing a bit, we're going to have to rethink a lot of things about service provision because, well, there's just not enough money. And everyone, it sounds convincing, doesn't it? Okay, well, if there's not enough money, you can't deliver services. That's, fair enough. And then 2008 banking crash happened, and Gordon Brown was actually the architect of the saviour of the system plan, which was bail out the banks, they're too big to fail. Remember, one bank did fall in the USA before Gordon Brown came up with his brilliant wheeze, what we need to do. And he was hailed as the savior of global capitalism for coming up with this brilliant wheeze, which was, we have to find the money. And it was a combination of printing money and borrowing money to basically nationalize the banks until such time as they were restabilized and then give them back to their owners at the cost of the taxpayers, essentially. And we have been paying ever since in massive austerity. And of course, people know there have been a huge number of studies done about, and I'm sure the estimates are very conservative ones, about how many deaths are directly attributable in Britain to austerity over the last now, how many years has it been? I can't count, 16 years. So all of these things are adding up. And then there's, of course, endless wars. There's the travesty over Brexit. So we are facing now a combination of terminal economic decline, massive and accelerating impoverishment of the British working class, with growing awareness of how politicians and media lie. And they don't lie by accident, they lie on purpose. In the early days of people being caught out in lies, there was a general kind of assumption that when they told the lie, they hadn't realized it was a lie. There was a lot of people giving people the benefit of the doubt. But now we've had so much evidence to the contrary. When Tony Blair said this about weapons of mass destruction, he knew already it was a lie when he was saying it. When Colin Powell took this vial of sarin or whatever it was into the United Nations and said, oh my God, they're about to kill everybody, he knew it was a lie when he did it, right? So all of this evidence has come out and created this situation where there's huge distrust. There's a real crisis for the ruling class in terms of its ability to keep social stability at home. In that situation where people are looking for answers more and more often, it is not an accident that a relatively insignificant group of Trotskyites suddenly got a huge load of funding and a slick rebrand. Number one, they called themselves communist, a word which the Trotskyites have shied away from traditionally, and particularly in recent years because of their entrenched anti-communism of the British working class as a result of decades and decades of anti-Soviet propaganda, right? So it's a reflection of the fact that people are starting to go against that propaganda. They're looking for communism actively now, that the socialist appeal was rebranded as the Revolutionary Communist Party. So revolution, communism, these are two things people are looking for. So they've rebranded it Revolutionary Communist Party. It's really noticeable that this Revolutionary Communist Party, so-called, has chosen to brand itself with a very Soviet aesthetic. Again, let's bear in mind that the whole raison d'etre of Trotskyism was to be anti-Soviet, in particular anti-Stalin. Well, they still are in substance anti-Stalin, and they don't miss an opportunity to tell you so. But it's very interesting that their aesthetic, full of pictures of Lenin, but the type of imagery they're using is very much actually from the Stalin era of the Soviet Union. Those types of images of Lenin come directly from that era. It's specifically designed to appeal to young people, students. They have got clearly a lot of money. They've got lots of full-timers, and they've got a huge advertising campaign. A lot of you will have noticed that their content is promoted up the algorithms on every social media platform where there's adverts and algorithms. You'll see there, if you're interested in left-wing content, you will have been offered some RCP content over the last few months, over the last year. They have had adverts on the tube, which I find very interesting because I'm pretty confident if our party went to the people who own the advertising slots on the tube and said, hello, we'd like to put some adverts in, they wouldn't just say, oh yeah, give me your money. They'd look at the adverts and say, I don't think so. Right? You can't imagine there aren't gatekeepers in those type of places. So it's very interesting to me that they're able to advertise on the tube. They have been piggybacking on the Palestine movement, trying to piggyback on the Palestine movement, and very specifically with the British branch, actually on all fronts trying to steal our clothes. So our clothes, specifically our party. So they called their rebranded newspaper The Communist. And as everybody knows, our website is The Communists, right? We've been there for quite a while using that name. So they've taken that. They've, like I said, their kind of design aesthetic has definite similarities to ours. Specifically when it comes to the Palestine movement, many of you will know we had 2 arrests of comrades of ours on Palestine solidarity demonstrations. First, under the Public Order Act for so-called anti-Semitism, and second under the Terrorism Act for apparently supporting a proscribed organisation. Because footage of one of those had gone viral, it brought attention to our party. Now, as you will know, our comrade Ranjit here did a very good job for the party, that when he was being arrested and people were around him filming that, he was giving a lecture to the policeman about what he was doing and who he was serving and who really was committing crimes and who really needed to be arrested. This footage went viral and attracted a lot of attention for our party in the Palestine Solidarity movement. The RCP staged an arrest clearly meant to steal the attention of people looking for footage of our party. They got themselves an Asian doctor called Raj, as opposed to Ranjit. They live streamed his arrest, very polite arrest, led away with no handcuffs to the back of a van. They just happened to be live streaming. It's amazing, isn't it? So they live streamed it. You know, it was all beautifully presented to the public, the arrest of their Dr. Raj, the Asian doctor, the Asian communist doctor. And then, of course, this guy was released a few hours later. He didn't have a kind of 24-hour holding. He didn't have his house raided by anti-terror police. He hasn't been doxxed by the Zionists. None of the things that have happened to our people have happened to this guy. But very much for the purposes of social media algorithm manipulation, this event was clearly staged to try to steal our party's clothes and divert attention away from actual communists. So you can see already what's the function really of this group, and that tells you quite a lot about what's the function of Trotskyism generally. They did a similar thing. The RCP put up a candidate in the general election when, again, there was a big spate of independent candidates being put up as a result of demand from the Palestine movement. The Palestine Solidarity Movement desperately wanted candidates who were pro-Palestine and who were not the Labour Party. And as a result of that, there was a whole spate of people who stood. The most serious of those obviously came from the Workers' Party, but there were quite a few others in different constituencies. And where they were serious about giving the workers a voice, they of course did not try to clash with one another. What was noticeable was, in seats where it looked like they might win, and remember 4 of them did win, but there were other seats where they came very, very close, and in each one of those there were either spoiler campaigns conducted or what looks like manipulation of votes by sitting Labour councils, who of course are in charge of the vote, fortuitously. The counting, I mean. Now, in the case of the RCP candidate, Fiona Lally, who's the lady they've been pushing everywhere. No, she was the RCP candidate in Stratford and Bow. Stratford and Bow was a constituency where the Workers' Party candidate, Halima Khan, had a real chance of garnering a big popular vote. And the RCP deliberately stood there to make sure that she wasn't able to make a serious independent campaign get off the ground. And she wasn't the only one. There were 4 spoiler candidates put up in that particular constituency. 4 of them. Obviously there to confuse the voters, obviously there because the ruling class was genuinely worried that Stratford and Bow was going to get an anti-Labour, pro-Palestine MP elected. And the RCP played its part in making sure that that is exactly what did not happen. Fiona Lally, in the various interviews she was given, some of them by so-called independent media, some of them by very unindependent media. She was interviewed at least once, maybe more than once, by, what's it called? GB News, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch, as we know. She was made famous, in fact, by being given the opportunity to have a face-to-face with Priti Patel when she was Home Secretary, which is a perfect opportunity. I mean, anyone in this room. Suella Braverman, sorry, Suella Braverman. They're interchangeable for me, these people. Some horrible Tory woman, but the point is, these horrible Tory women, it's an easy takedown, isn't it? It's an easy opportunity. If you put most of the people in this room, on camera opposite Suella Braverman, they could do a pretty good job of making her look silly and themselves look good. So that was a very nice opportunity that was given to her. And then it went viral, of course, and everyone, she's suddenly her name's on everyone's lips. Whenever she's interviewed, she makes the point of saying that communism does not equal the Soviet Union and socialist planning does not equal Stalinism. Right. So, yes, we need socialism, we need a revolution, we need central planning, but not like they did it in the Soviet Union. So,
we need a total revolution.
They've got a nice new formula. So we've talked about, what's the background for why this is all happening, and you can understand, given the huge level of distrust of the mass of the working class in this country for establishment politicians and media, the very urgent need for the ruling class to make sure that there are plenty of fake opposition politicians and pseudo-independent media to catch and divert the people leaning towards socialist ideas and make sure they don't join a genuine communist revolutionary organisation and start to be a real threat to the state. So, for example, we also have so-called independent media like Novara Media, Double Down News, all these channels which, on the face of it, when you first come across them, look as if they're what you've been looking for, right? Oh, brilliant, here's independent people talking about real things that really matter to working people. And you have to watch it for quite a while to realise how much poison they're smuggling in with every apparently good message that they're putting out there. Now, Trotskyism has always played this role of spreading counter-revolutionary propaganda amongst the working class in the name of the revolution. So, the ruling class has several strands of diverting angry people's energy and attention away from actual revolution and unity. And, some of it comes on the right-wing libertarian type of side, some of it focuses on immigration, some of it focuses on green politics, but there's one strand which focuses very heavily on revolutionary politics, and that is Trotskyism. And they are especially focused themselves, the Trotskyists, on youth and students in particular. And of course, it's not an accident that they do that. Students have been a very essential part of every single successful revolutionary movement because they have time, energy, and education to put at the service of the movement when they're persuaded that it's the right thing to do. They also have the youthful ardor and energy, which can be, super important to finding people who are really ready and willing to dedicate, time and energy to the cause, which of course we need to do if we're going to be successful, right? The thing about students is, and young people generally, is they are less able in the early days of their political life. I'm not saying they're stupid, but less able in the early days of their political life to detect the pro-imperialist politics underneath the ultra-revolutionary slogans that the Trotskyites use. So they attract students with slogans that sound super, super revolutionary. And they are hiding an essence which is totally counter-revolutionary. But what they do with this combination, and remember they have a lot of funding to be on every student campus. There is a group of Trotskyites on every student campus in the land, in every imperialist country. And these Trotskyite groups, many of them, you won't meet them anywhere in the streets. Literally their job is to set up Marxist study circles and Marxist campaign groups inside the university to attract young people who are just leaving home, just starting to feel like they want to get involved politically, feeling like they're attracted towards revolutionary theory and ideas, to pull those people in, to fill their heads with Trotskyist prejudice and anti-communist lies, to keep them very, very busy when they're keen and enthusiastic, doing things which are basically pointless or counterproductive, until such time as they become cynical and fall out. And at the end of that process, they think they've seen communism, tried it, and realize, wait, there's no point.
Bastards.
So fundamentally, what is Trotskyism? It's an anti-worker, anti-Marxist tradition named after its founder, Leon Trotsky. Now, I will talk a little in a minute about the essence of Leon Trotsky and his life work. But Leon Trotsky is presented to the followers of his tradition as the true inheritor of Lenin and the Bolshevik Revolution. And it's not only Trotskyites who say this. The reason Trotskyites are able to make so much headway with young people is because the entirety of British media and education and academia agrees with this line, that Trotsky was the true inheritor of Lenin, the inspirer of the Bolshevik Revolution, the real power behind the throne, the real, mover of the masses, the founder of the Red Army, basically single-handedly led, guided, and ran the revolution. And if Trotsky wasn't the best Leninist, then perhaps even Lenin was really the best Trotskyist. So essentially, this is the narrative that is pushed on people in the West from their youngest days. As soon as they start to come across any narrative about World War II or the Russian Revolution or any of these things, they start to be given these lies. And it's backed up by everything they ever read. Every World War II book, go into a Waterstones. You will not find one volume of Stalin or Mao in a Waterstones. You will find books by Trotsky, and you will find reams of books about the Russian Revolution, telling Trotsky's version of what happened in that revolution. Trotsky's version, which is famous for self-aggrandizement and total distortion of every event. So the three main features of Trotsky's theory, if you want to call it that, and really in many ways it's difficult to accuse Trotsky of having a coherent theory, because at different times he said opposing things. And what you'll find unites Trotsky's utterances across the years is not a coherent internal worldview, but opposition to Lenin and Leninism and the Bolshevik Party and the Soviet state. So, but the main kind of theoretical foundations that you can point to are, number one, advocacy of something that he called the theory of permanent revolution. What was the theory of permanent revolution? It's a route from which many later problems spring. And essentially it says that revolution in Russia, because Russia was so backward and didn't have a massive proletariat and had a huge peasantry, revolution in Russia was impossible to carry through, a socialist revolution in Russia was impossible to carry through unless revolution happened simultaneously in the advanced capitalist countries of Western Europe, and they would come to the rescue of the revolution in Russia and make it permanent. So what he was basically saying, because the way it's presented to us in the West in this very kind of glib way, is Trotsky wanted revolution to be permanent, as if everybody else didn't. Right? No, what Trotsky said was, the only way our revolution will be permanent is if people from outside come and rescue it. I.e., we can make a socialist revolution temporarily, but it will fail without outside help. That's the theory of permanent revolution, which is why, of course, people have also dubbed it a theory of permanent hopelessness. And the reason Trotsky came to this conclusion was that he consistently underestimated the revolutionary potential of all the other forces on which Leninism relies. So first and foremost, it was the peasantry, the poor peasants inside Russia. Lenin identified as early as, before 1900, as having a revolutionary, and he was a very young man those days, remember, he wasn't even 30 yet, and he was writing and showing how the poor peasantry in Russia was a revolutionary force and that needed to be harnessed by the proletariat to make the socialist revolution. He said they've got nothing to gain from the present system. The present system, capitalism, is totally impoverishing them and ruining them, and that makes them a revolutionary force that we need to harness and guide and lead. So that was the program of the Bolsheviks. Trotsky always denied you could get anything from the peasantry. He despised them. He had the same kind of attitude towards the peasantry, really, that, you know, most ruling class people have towards all the workers. Like, you know, they're plebs, they're ignorant, they're backward, you can't do anything with them. There's no way you can educate them. Look at them, look how backward they are. If you read anything by Trotsky, he uses the word backward about his own country and his own people endlessly. And after he left, he uses it about the Soviet Union endlessly, you know, predicting how this can't work and that can't work because everybody's too backward. And that's the end of that. So the idea that people can develop, can change, you know, if you go about it the right way, that's all gone. It's just that they're permanently backward, you know, they're illiterate, they're, you know, don't understand modern life, they're not cultured and civilized like what we are. So he denied that there was any possibility of harnessing the revolutionary power of the poor peasants in Russia for the revolution. Hence, the proletariat is too small to make the revolution, hence we need the West to come and save us, right? He also denied that there was any revolutionary potential in the oppressed nations of the Russian Empire. Again, he sees oppressed nations as a mixture of backward peasants and bourgeois forces, both of which are, as far as he's concerned, inherently reactionary, therefore you can't rely on them. So the objective reality that the oppressed nations were suffering massively under Russian imperialism, and therefore their revolutionary energies could be harnessed against Russian imperialism, and even for building socialism, that was something that he completely refused to accept. And hence his totally pessimistic view of the potential in Russia for revolution. Trotsky also had total contempt for Lenin's insistence that the only path to success for the communists is to build a disciplined organization. He hated the reality and even the idea of discipline because he was an individualist, egotist par excellence. And he split with Lenin over this question. So he worked alongside Lenin in the early days of the Iskra newspaper for literally maybe 2 years. As soon as the Second Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, which is what the communists were called those days, in 1903 took place, there was a big split over the question of the rules of the party, which was all about organisation. Are we an organisation where anybody who self-identifies as a revolutionary can just enrol themselves and say, I'm a member? Yep, I'm a member, I like revolution, I'm a member of the party. Or do there need to be serious criteria and serious discipline in our ranks because we're actually building an army for making a revolution and leading the forces of the working class? And that's a serious effort, requires a serious approach. So Lenin took the latter view. Trotsky sided firmly with the former view. And that caused the split, the famous split into Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. Bolshevik meaning majority, Menshevik meaning minority. And at that moment in history, the Bolsheviks were the majority in the party, and that's where they got their name Bolshevik from. And it became a proud name in its own right because they were, of course, the ones who went on to build the revolutionary party that successfully carried out the revolution. So, of course, their views on organisation were proved correct by history. They were the ones using that formulation who were actually able to build. That is why every single communist party formed after the October Revolution took those principles as their Bible and said, because Lenin and the Bolsheviks had proved in practice, this is actually what you need. If you are working to win, this is what you have to do. And so, of course, we study that experience, and of course, we take seriously our duty to build what was then known as the party of a new type. And it still, in many ways, is a party of a new type. It's still very hard to find parties that genuinely carry out Leninist methods of organization. So Trotsky had total contempt for discipline and serious organisation. He hated anybody to have any power over him, although he was very fond of being given power over other people. So he was definitely the type of intellectual we've all met, where the rules are for everybody else but not for me. He likes rules when he can apply them to other people, not so keen on rules if they apply to him. And of course, what we talked about earlier, you know, the main thing that distinguishes Trotskyism is its opposition, consistent opposition to all the leaders of Bolshevism. Bolshevism being the same thing Lenin is basically. So that's in particular Lenin, and after Lenin's death, Stalin, as the person who was the most faithful, brilliant pupil of Lenin and faithful executor of Leninism after Lenin's death. There's lots and lots of myths. I won't go into all of them. They're in the pamphlet, and they're even better explained in this book here, that are put forth by ruling class media and emanated originally from Trotsky himself about what Trotsky did and how he was so brilliant. If you want to be made really sick, glance at some of the pages of Trotsky's autobiography, which is called My Life. And just as a little aside, I think it's very interesting to note, there is no revolutionary leader of the time who had the time or inclination to write autobiographies or even to get other people to write biographies of them, right? They were not interested in personal aggrandizement. They didn't have time for it, and they didn't think the revolution was about personalities. But Trotsky definitely did. Trotsky thought everything was all about him. I think it was John Reed, I could be wrong, it might have been Arthur Ransom or one of those people who was hanging around, who said about Trotsky when he saw him in Russia in 1917, he would die for the revolution if he had a big enough audience. So myths abound that he was the founder and inspirer and great leader of the Red Army and all its victories. There's some beautiful descriptions in our pamphlet about how at every front that Trotsky was put in charge of when he was leading a leader in the Red Army, he had to be taken away from it because it got into trouble and someone else had to be sent to sort it out. Very often the person who was sent to sort it out was Joseph Stalin. This is something. Joseph Stalin didn't go around blowing a trumpet saying what an important role he played in the October Revolution and in the Red Army. But in fact, if you look at it, he did play an extremely significant role. He was one of the few people who was appointed to the organising committee for the uprising when it took place in Petrograd, like the revolution. Trotsky was not in that group. He was the one who kept being sent around the country during the Civil War and War of Intervention to sort out messes on military fronts that had been created by Trotsky's posing. He was a serious military person and a serious revolutionary as opposed to a poser. Trotsky essentially, you know, he joined the Bolsheviks when it became clear.
I think it was Robert Bruce Lockhart who said that.
Okay, Robert Bruce Lockhart apparently was the guy who saw Trotsky posing around and said he'd die for the revolution. One of those guys anyway, who was hanging around, having a look at what was going on those days. So Trotsky joined the Bolsheviks very shortly before the uprising took place. He joined them basically as a spent force. All of his ideas had come to nothing, had been disproved. He had no organisation of his own. He came to the party as an individual, promising to amend his ways, promising that he'd given up all of his old ideas about organisation, accepting the party's programme and discipline, and promising to work under its direction. On that basis, he was admitted to the party, and, you know, was part of the party and part of the new Soviet state after the successful uprising. So he had an opportunity there to redeem himself. If he genuinely wanted to be part of making history, he could have become a good Leninist from that point onwards. In fact, he didn't. He was very soon up to his old tricks of trying to form blocs and factions and undermine Lenin and attack policy on all kinds of fronts. And in fact, ended up by forming an illegal party. Remember, at a certain point, still while Lenin was still alive, so maybe 1922 or 23, I forget the year, there was a party congress, maybe the 10th party congress, at which, because Trotsky was making so much trouble in the party, when they had big jobs on hand, I think they were just finishing the Civil War, right? And they had so much work to do reconstructing the country. And Trotsky was busy forming factions and trying to have ideological debates. And at that party, Lenin insisted they have a debate about factionalism. And the party brought in a rule that said factionalism is against party rules and anybody involved in trying to form a faction will be expelled. Nothing more to be said on that matter. We will not have this. We've got work to do. And Trotsky is just taking up airtime and distracting people from their work. And nobody's really interested in the questions he's raising. He's just taking, it's a bit like our friend at the door there. You know, you can make a lot of noise and distract a lot of people's attention. That doesn't mean anyone's interested in what you're saying. It doesn't mean you represent something important, right? The questions he was bringing up were not questions that were taxing the mass of the Soviet people. They weren't things that were really bothering everybody. They were a massive distraction. And so Lenin made a point of stopping that. You know, the party congress agreed with Lenin and made a point of stopping that. Trotsky did not stop. Trotsky carried on his factional activity. Documents now show, in fact, or they showed at the Moscow trials, that Trotsky from, I think, as early as 1921 or 23, was getting funding from German imperialism to pursue his activities. He had formed an illegal party in order to print, produce, and propagate subversive material, attacking the line of the party, attacking the leadership of the party, demoralizing people about the prospects of building socialism and that all the lines being followed are the wrong ones and all the rest of it. He was endlessly predicting doom. So, of course, he first of all, he started by saying the revolution can't succeed without the world, revolution in Russia can't succeed without the world revolution. Then he said, the revolution did succeed. We can't build socialism. It's not possible. The peasantry can't be engaged for this task. Initially, when Lenin brought in the new economic policy, which was an unleashing of the market, of capitalist elements, in order to resuscitate production in war-torn, really destroyed Russia, following the end of the really horrific few years of war that followed the revolution. The new economic policy was launched as a retreat from socialist planning, saying that we're not able to just direct the economy in the way we'd like to. We need to unleash some of these forces to get production going again. It's a retreat and it's going to bring problems, but it's temporary. When he first launched it, Trotsky was all against it. This is terrible. This is going to reintroduce capitalism. This is the end of everything. Then when they were ready to end the NEP and say, right, now we can get on with socialist planning, he said, no, you can't do that, you can't do that. We're not ready yet, we're not ready. And he denounced socialist planning as the introduction, now listen to this racist language, as the introduction of Asiatic bazaars. Right? If you don't have the market, what you've got, the alternative to the market is Asiatic bazaars. With collectivization, same thing. Before the founder, so successful collectivization relies specifically on the ability to provide cooperative farms with machinery. So what's the prerequisite, I can't say that word, for giving people up-to-date machines? It's an industrial base. You have to be producing up-to-date machines to give them to the farmers who are going to get together in collectives so they can make a go of their collective farming, right? Modern farming requires modern machinery. Modern machinery requires industrial base. So you can't collectivize until you've built up your industrial base and you're producing a good supply regularly of modern machines for farming. So when did Trotsky want to collectivize? Before they'd done the first 5-year plan, before they had laid their industrial base. And he wanted to do it as a directive. Just tell everybody you're collectivizing now. Forced collectivization was his plan way too early. And of course the party said no. Then, at the time of the second 5-year plan, when the first 5-year plan had been finished 9 months early, completed, delivered everything it promised after 4 years and 3 months, and They had laid this incredible industrial base, and they had the technological underpinnings necessary to go ahead with collectivization, and they needed to do it, and they knew that they needed to do it in order to strengthen the Soviet Union against the attack from the West that they knew was inevitably going to come. They needed to get on with collectivizing, and they had the basis for doing it. Then Trotsky was against it. And one of the comments he said was, commodities must be adapted to human needs. 1933. This is the great pure revolutionary. This is his idea of how you build the socialist state. You adapt commodities to human needs. Doesn't sound like someone who spent much time studying capital, does it? He called for postponing the second five-year plan. He said, what did he say? Away with shrieking enthusiasm. Like all of these people are too enthusiastic, but they haven't understood that we're not ready yet, even though the first five-year plan has just been an amazing success. So hence all the shrieking enthusiasm, right? People were genuinely amazed at what they had achieved and ready to go forward with some more. He wanted the kulaks not to be liquidated as a class. And just so people know, because this is another way that the Soviet Union is constantly kind of denigrated in the West, and particularly in our education system, this concept of liquidation, people don't understand what it means. They think liquidating means shooting everybody. Of course it doesn't. That's one means of liquidating a problem. It's not the only one. When the Soviet Union talked about liquidating the kulaks as a class, what they meant was, we're going to take away your ability to exploit. They prevented people from being able to exploit in the countryside. So the kulaks were capitalist farmers who profited by exploiting rural labor, buying and selling goods, etc. So the kulaks were targeted by the second five-year plan, I'm pretty sure, during the collectivization drive, and they were, of course, allowed to stay and farm if they wanted to, and join the collective farms and become Soviet peasants and members of collectives. But what they were not allowed to retain was their position as exploiters in the countryside. That's what it meant by liquidating. Trotsky was opposed to this and said they should be restricted in their what do you call it? Exploiting tendencies should be restricted. But we shouldn't outright try to liquidate them as a class. That was when, finally, they had the ability to liquidate them as a class. Now, of course, the whole job of socialism is step by step to lay the groundwork for abolishing the market and abolishing thereby exploitation of one person by another. Which is, of course, the only way to abolish inequality. You don't abolish inequality by decree. You don't abolish it by universalizing poverty. The way you do it is on the basis of modern means of production put at the disposal of the population through a planned economy. But you don't do that by decree either. The brilliance of the five-year plans in the period of socialist construction under Stalin's leadership was the step-by-step realization of that program in a really systematic way. So like I said, they didn't just come in and say, right, we believe in collective farms. Well, in fact, we believe in state farms, because collective farms are still buying and selling for the market. They're producing collectively, but then they're selling their goods on the market. So you still have commodity production. In fact, but it's a step towards state farming, under which the agricultural produce will no longer be a product of the market. Right? The job of socialism is to take these steps as and when it's possible, step by step, but relentlessly, to create the conditions for the next step at each stage, right? So you prepare the way, then you take the step, prepare the way, take the step, right? You lay the foundation for the success of the next step, but the whole role is to constantly be restricting the sphere of the market and expanding the sphere of planning. That's the job of socialism before we can transition on to communism, right? The lower stage as opposed to the higher stage. So Trotsky at every stage is telling shrieking. He's denouncing people for shrieking with enthusiasm, but in fact he was the one who was using money from abroad to amplify his message of constant pessimism, or to derail, confuse, worry, undermine all these efforts. But despite all of this very anti-Soviet and anti-state activity, Stalin was firmly opposed during this period to Trotsky and Trotskyists being suppressed. There's speeches where he says it to the party congress. We don't need to suppress Trotsky and Trotskyism, we need to defeat them ideologically. And that is exactly what they did. They waged from 1924 onwards an ideological battle against Trotskyism, and it became a totally irrelevant and spent force because of that.
Liquidate Trotskyism as a trend.
And that is what they did. So I don't want to go on for too much longer, comrades. The pamphlet is what you need to read to get all of these details. As we all know, Trotsky didn't give up his factional activities. He was in the pay of Western intelligence agencies for a long time. It's a moot point how long that goes back, because he had some very dodgy connections even before the revolution. And there are, you know, for example, in the very back in one of the appendixes of the pamphlet, we've pointed to 2 articles produced relatively recently by some obscure academic who studied this question in great detail, that Trotsky was picked up by British intelligence in the USA just on his way to returning to Russia in the revolutionary period. And there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that there was a big plot to make him a British asset. Whether or not they succeeded, we can't say for sure, but I think the writer of those articles feels that probably they did. So either way, he had a lot of connections with the intelligence type of people going a long way back. Certainly, it was revealed in the Moscow trials that by 1921, he was in touch with German intelligence and offering his services to them in return for money so that he could pursue his activities in the Soviet Union against the government, against Lenin. Remember, Lenin was still the leader then. Of course, after Lenin died, he repackaged his anti-Leninism as defending Leninism and Bolshevism against the evil Stalin usurper. And this, of course, is the mythology which has been propagated ever since in the West. But it could not be further from the truth. And if you examine, you know, Trotsky's life and work, you will see that his anti-Leninism goes right the way back to 1903 and is totally consistent from that date forward. Once he was, you know, finally he had to be kicked out of the USSR because his activities could no longer be tolerated. And then it was revealed at the Moscow trials during the 1930s that he continued to be in contact with Trotskyites and anti-government elements all the way through the 1930s, directing them from abroad, channeling money into them, and that they were involved in wrecking activities, saboteur, assassinations, the assassination of Kirov. They tried to assassinate Stalin and many other leading Bolshevik figures. They did assassinate Gorky, I think, Maxim Gorky, and his son. So they did some very high-level, disruptive and nasty assassinations. They did some horrible saboteur activities against, you know, infrastructure and industry that was being built. They were desperate to bring about Trotsky's predictions of doom. Trotsky had been constantly saying they can't build socialism, it's going to fall, they can't. If there's a war coming, they'll definitely be defeated because everybody hates Stalin and the party is really weak now and the masses are unhappy and they've just been whipped into line, but that means that if there's a war, the whole place is going to fall apart. All of these were Trotsky's predictions. Sadly, he was killed too early to see all of his predictions come to nothing, came to the war. But they did, of course, come to nothing. He died in 1940 in ignominious failure and exile. He was killed not by Stalin, but by one of his own followers over a personal spat, which kind of fits quite nicely, I think, with the rest of his life. And essentially, I think that would have been the end of Trotsky if it wasn't for what happened in 1956. Hands up, who knows what happens in 1956, just to get a... rough idea of her. Yes, good. So in 1956, as we know, so Stalin died in 1953. And it turns out that the Moscow trials missed a significant section of anti-Soviet sleepers in the party because they managed to come to power after the death of Stalin, led, of course, by Nikita Khrushchev. And in 1956, Khrushchev and the Trotskyyites got to work in deadly earnest in undermining and steadily reversing the most important planks of the dictatorship of the proletariat, the connections of the party with the masses, and the foundations of economic planning. And as part of this drive, they began, in the classic Trotskyite way, by defaming Stalin. And of course, as we all know, attacks on Stalin are attacks on Lenin and Leninism in disguise. Khrushchev, I don't think in that speech, it's a while since I read it, I don't think he mentioned Trotsky. But if you read the so-called secret speech, of course it wasn't a secret to the rest of the world, it was kept secret from the people of the Soviet Union and published in newspapers all around the rest of the world. It had particularly the effect of demobilizing half the world communist movement in the space of 12 months. It was hugely disorientating, demoralizing for communists who had been following the Soviet Union's progress and believing in its leadership, of course rightly believing in its leadership. But when the next leader of the Soviet Union, who they instinctively assumed was someone to be trusted, got on the world stage and told them a whole load of lies about Joseph Stalin, it was really confusing and made people think they'd been following a lie all along. Our movement has not recovered from what happened in 1956 to this day. But what Khrushchev essentially did was resuscitate Trotsky. Almost all the lies he told, and our comrade Grover Furr wrote a lovely book called Khrushchev Lied. And he counted the lies in that speech. I forget the number now. It was a big number. And he said, when he came to talk to us after we'd written that book, Khrushchev Lied, he said, for the purposes of publicity and selling the book, it would have been much better if I could have found one or two things in that speech which were true. It would have looked much better. He said, but I've been in the archives and I can't lie to you. Every single statement against Stalin in that speech was a lie. So the archives belie everything Khrushchev said. He knew it at the time. It was part of his attack on the dictatorship of the proletariat and the prestige of the Bolshevik party, the prestige of socialism and the mechanics of socialism. The builder of socialism was under attack. And through him, the founder of socialism, Lenin. But all the lies essentially come out of Trotsky. They were all already being propagated by Trotsky in the earlier part of the century. So that gave the opportunity to the ruling classes in the West that they were very quick to jump on to resuscitate the Trotskyite movement. Because what you saw in 1956 was a whole load of communist parties basically took their cue from Khrushchev. They'd been used to following the Soviet Union and assuming that the leadership of the Soviet Union was the best Marxism out there. Khrushchev comes and gives a new line to the world communist movement. It's a revisionist line. It says peaceful coexistence with imperialism. It says parliamentary road to revolution, no revolution needed, parliamentary road to socialism. Work with the social democrats. Let's not have class war because there'll be nuclear war and nobody wants that, do they? Does that sound familiar? Nobody wants a nuclear war, so we must peacefully work towards our aims. And the Soviet Union is just going to peacefully compete with the imperialist world, and we'll outcompete them because socialism's better and the class war's over, comrades, and we're advancing to communism. Doesn't that sound nice? Yes, it really does after World War II.
He also offered to join NATO.
He offered to be friends in many ways with the imperialists.
And they wouldn't have him.
So that gave an opportunity because the the communist parties, the official communist Third International, well, what had been the Third International parties, of course the Third International was disbanded during World War II. Those parties which were all affiliated with the Soviet Union around the world followed the Soviet Union into revisionism. They gave up the revolutionary path, and it created this space. Number one, a whole load of people looking for a genuine revolutionary alternative. Number two, Khrushchev has just repeated all these Trotskyite lies. So in come the Trotsky, suddenly with a burst of money and organization and vigor and energy saying, we were right all along. Look, all these things we said about Stalin were true. If you want the real revolution, come to us. And it worked. In the West, they were able to harness a whole load of popular revolutionary sentiment that felt let down by Stalin and felt like the official communist parties were not revolutionary enough, which of course they weren't. You know, that's a just criticism. But of course, the fake revolutionary fervor of the Trotskyites is in fact even less revolutionary than the fake path to socialism of the revisionists. So Khrushchev massively resuscitated Trotskyism, and we've been living with that ever since. But just to round up, and before I hand over to Alex, you know, what we notice today about Trotskyite parties is that they will, just like their founder, they will always find a way to side with counter-revolution. It's gone into in great detail in the pamphlet, the way various British Trotskyite organisations responded to the crisis and then the collapse of the Soviet Union. And essentially it was with glee. They said, here's the real revolution. You know, some of them even talked about Boris Yeltsin as a revolutionary, as opposed to the Stalinist Gorbachev. I mean, you couldn't get more confused than that. But essentially they were telling people to celebrate the fall of the Soviet Union because now we can have the real revolution. So they always find a way to side with counter-revolution. They always find a way to side with imperialism when it comes to national struggles. So Alex is going to talk a little bit more about this in the recent wars, I hope. But for example, when I was young, I used to hear Trotskyites saying how we can't possibly... Now remember, you know, I'm from a generation where the key pivotal question of British imperialism through my youth was the Irish liberation struggle. In Ireland, the Republicans of Northern Ireland were fighting an actual war against British imperialism and a British imperialist occupation. It was a very live issue and a very important one for judging who's a genuine anti-imperialist and who isn't. And the Trotskyites would always say, oh, you can't possibly support the IRA because their leadership is bourgeois. And this is a classic way that they tell people that they don't have to support an anti-imperialist struggle. They always did the same when I was young with Palestine. You can't support the PLO, they're bourgeois.
And they do it today with Palestine.
They still do it. So you can't support the government of Bashar al-Assad, you can't support the government of Vladimir Putin, they're all bourgeois. So, you know, we're revolutionaries, we support the proletariat, we can't support the bourgeoisie. So this extension of the failure to understand where the real revolutionary forces are in the world, total failure to accept, or denial of, in fact, Lenin's theory on imperialism and what that means for the world in actual fact. In fact, I can remember very early demonstration I went on independently, as in not taken by a parent. I was a student in January 1991, the first Gulf War. So the Soviet Union still officially existed and actually joined, to the great shame of the Soviet people. I'm pretty sure they joined that coalition, huge coalition that was brought together against Iraq in 1991. They basically green-lighted it. But the huge number of forces did join that. They got a massive load of countries together. It was a real, you know, moment where the Soviet Union had been kind of sidelined, and you know, it was all guns blazing for Iraq. And I went along to a demonstration in Hyde Park, and I bumped into our comrades Hopal and Ella and Iris and Godfrey and some others who were Chima, who were selling Lalkar at that event. It was a big rally in Hyde Park. And they gave me some Lalkars to hold, so I'm holding copies of Lalkar, and it talks about British imperialism or Anglo-American imperialism on the front cover. And some Trotskyite came up to me and started screaming in my face that there's no such thing as imperialism. And I'll never forget it. Now, what was interesting was to see how, by 2003, they had to change their clothes a little bit. Now they have to talk about imperialism because it's been generally accepted that there is such a thing, and it's kind of too inescapable to get away from. So what they do is they talk about US/UK imperialism, which is a very imprecise and unclear term, and but never what that actually means. It just means war is not a nice thing, essentially. They never really explain what imperialism is, how it works, why it's a problem, and what therefore, how the reality of imperialism in the world today affects how we approach the question of making a socialist revolution and fighting the imperialists. But they have been forced to acknowledge in words and in their slogans, for example, the placards you'll see from SWP and Stop the War, slogans that say, you know, stop US-UK imperialism. I watched that change in my lifetime, that they would not use that word, and then they felt like they were forced to. And I don't think an insignificant role in that was played by the comrades around Lalkar, and we were in the SLP then, and then our party, constantly pushing into the movement at every opportunity this line about British imperialism, American imperialism, Anglo-American imperialism. We may be small, but theoretically we have a big impact on the movement simply because our analysis is very principled, very thorough, very consistent, and very hard to escape from if you operate anywhere in the left. And it's one of the things that someone said about our party in the very early days in a fit of irritation, said about us, they're creepily omnipresent, meaning you can't get away from the buggers. And it's true, you can't. If you're serious about, left-wing politics in this country, eventually you are going to come across us. And the leaders in the movement find our analysis particularly annoying because we touch on all the things they're trying to avoid. Yes, just lastly, I think it's useful to recognize or understand that there are 1,000 varieties of Trotskyism. And the reason is simple. When you realize the role it plays is as a disorganizer of working class energy. So if you stop trying to understand it as a kind of worldview and start realizing it that it's a useful tool for presenting fake activity and anti-communist ideas in revolutionary clothes, different Trotskyite organizations have been founded and funded to target specific sections of the population and specifically struggling populations. So, for example, you can now find Trotskyite organizations which will appear to be really good on imperialism and say quite good things about Russia and China. But one thing they won't do is say anything good about Stalin's Soviet Union, anything good about Leninist principles of organization, and anything about the ability to join the struggles of the oppressed peoples with the struggles of the working class at home. I did once come across a Trotskyite group whose specialism was supporting the Irish liberation struggle. I've come across Trotskyite groups who have a specialism in supporting Libya, Cuba. Yeah, well, there are some very well-known Trotskyite organizations who get a lot of credibility from their relationship with the Cuban government. So there are, as I say, many, many strands focusing on different things, and they're all ways of catching different sections of people who have become interested in left-wing politics for different reasons. So there was one section, one small Trotskyite organisation that basically seemed to have been founded to catch the London Irish during the period of the Liberation War. Specifically, just in London, targeting the Irish community who was starting to be a bit revolutionary, starting to lean, because of the situation of the war, because of the way they were being targeted in Britain during that time under terrorism laws. It was radicalising them and revolutionising them. They were starting to look around and get exposed to revolutionary ideas. People forget that in the early days of that national liberation struggle, the fighters involved in it were looking around the world for inspiration. They were reading Ho Chi Minh, they were reading Mao, they were reading all kinds of very revolutionary texts and being exposed to many ideas. So a lot of Irish Republicans started to become very revolutionary in their thinking. And a Trotskyite organisation sprang up amongst the London Irish, specifically to harness that type of thinking person and make sure they didn't become part of a growing, broad, genuine revolutionary communist movement. So I think I'll probably leave it there, comrades. That gives you a general, I hope, overview of what is Trotskyism, how is it used, what are the roots of what we can call Trotskyite theory, and what role has it always played. And then I'm going to pass over then to Alex to talk a bit about how these organisations operate inside the trade unions and the anti-war type struggle today. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Joti, for that very good overview and introduction to the subject and the outlining to us some origins of the criminal behaviour of Trotskyism. I speak as somebody who was part of a Trotskyite organisation. Yeah, I know it's pantomime season, but really, if this turns into too much of a confession, be sure to let me know, and I'll make it slightly less Catholic. The whole question of Trotskyism in the imperialist countries has to be understood in the context of, as Joti was outlining, the founder of the movement's own biases towards, towards the imperialist countries, his favourable opinions towards the imperialist countries, in truth. And therefore it is no surprise that Trotskyite movements, when they emerge, are riddled often with a very shall we say, pro-imperialist sentiments dressed up in ultra-left language, with a level of what can only be described as Western chauvinism marking a lot of their analysis. And as Joti was saying, this all comes from their founder, a founder who loathed and detested the Russian peasantry, maybe because of his origins as the son of a landowner in the country that is now called Ukraine, and also a complete underestimation of the role of the masses in the revolutionary movement, in the building of socialism. Now, before I get into the subject of trade unionism, I would be remiss if I didn't tell you what Trotsky's view on trade unionism in the Soviet Union was. Joti touched on the debate there, but just to outline it. Trotsky, and this is something I only discovered when I bought the Stalin's selected works edition entitled On the Opposition, where Stalin's critique of Trotsky's position from 1921 is outlined. And Trotsky's position on the trade unions in the Soviet Union was that they should basically be run by the state, and that the state should order workers around, not use persuasion, not win over the masses, not seek to bring the masses with you. And when I first read that, all the way back in 2014, when I first got hold of a copy of that book, that was like an asteroid across the sky moment, because it's the complete opposite of what the Trotskyites teach you. The Trotskyite point of view that is hammered into the heads of those of us who were unfortunate enough to join one of the myriad of Trotskyite organizations in Britain is that it was the bad Stalin dictating to the workers, dictating to the peasants. He and his bureaucratic clique were running everything. And Stalin ignored the views of the peasants and ignored the views of the workers, and that's why the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. And if that sounds nonsensical, it's because if you stop to think about it for more than 5 seconds, it is. The actual reality was that at every single turn, Trotsky was the one using what was, I think Lenin called it, Prussian methods to run things. Basically, that I, the great revolutionary leader, Trotsky, have ordered it, therefore it must be so. And this was his attitude on many different questions, particularly when it came to the role of the masses. And so this isn't an irrelevant historical detail, comrades. This informs how most of the Trotskyite hierarchy acts today. It's how they act in the trade union movement, which is using the language, ultra-left, very revolutionary sounding language, but when it comes down to it, acting like a standard trade union bureaucrat. Now, I was a member of the Socialist Party of England and Wales, or SPEW, as it's known by its rather charming acronym. A more fitting acronym you couldn't find. Shows that humour and self-awareness is not amongst these people's skills. But the point about the Socialist Party was that it was very strong in what was then my trade union, and for my sins I was in the British Civil Service, but don't get the lynching squad out just yet, I have left. The point about it is that they were in, along with the SWP and other Trotskyite groups, they were in a very strong position in the Public and Commercial Services Union, which was my union for a number of years. And the way they wielded that influence was telling in terms of how they exercised it, in terms of what they were pursuing. What they were pursuing was not we can debate separately whether trying to win civil servants over to a revolutionary consciousness is a particularly wise idea anyway, but we can come back to that at another time. But they were not about winning over the workers towards a more revolutionary position or a position of advanced militancy. Not really. What were they actually about? They were about capturing bureaucratic positions. I went to a number of internal caucus meetings inside with the party at the time, and what it was all about was running for national executive committee positions, running for regional committee positions, getting control of the big industrial groups inside the union, and getting your people into these key slots and keeping them there. Now, if anybody's had any experience in the British trade union movement, you'll know that the turnout level of these elections never goes above about 10%. So this is why the Trotskyites are also obsessed with capturing a few key workplaces. Because if you can capture a few key workplaces, you can basically guarantee that your people will be in position on the National Executive Committee for years and years and years. And so if you get a turnout of like 8%, but you get a big turnout from, say, in the civil service, like Department for Work and Pensions and HM Revenue and Customs, the two big civil service employers, then you will get a number of your people in key positions. And you can use that to essentially steer things in the direction that are of interest to the Trotskyite party. Getting more prominent positions in the trade union's conference, for instance. Getting your party publication a more prominent place inside the trade union. It's all about building the sect, their sect. It's not about actually bringing on the level of consciousness of the workers, because one thing that all of the Trotskyite groups have in common in Britain is that none of them will ever make a serious study and teach their members about the lessons Lenin taught in What Is to Be Done. They will never do that. And why will they never do that? Because in there, Lenin makes the very, very clear point, and he makes it overwhelmingly, regarding the limitations of trade unionism and the trade union consciousness. And again, he's taking that further, but that point is within the writings of Marx and Engels themselves. They're very clear on it as well. The people who aren't clear are those who, for the last 100 or so years, have had an interest in embedding themselves within the trade union bureaucracy. So what you have is, in my case, it was the Socialist Party, it could be the SWP or the International Socialists as they were known back in the day, or the Workers' Revolutionary Party, or so many others, is a lot of left language about they will always say, we are the ones who are for rank and file control. We want to have, the workers must run the union. We must push these damn bureaucrats out of the way. But what they're really interested in is becoming the bureaucrats. And in that, they are completely in line with the Labour left and the Khrushchevite revisionists, formerly known as the CPGB, now known as the CPB. And it's no coincidence that all of these people, all of these groups, quite happily work together when it comes to divvying up seats inside union bodies, when it comes to backing candidates. For instance, In the Unite elections in the early 2010s, you'll find the Trotskyite groups, the CPB, and the Labour left all on side with people like Len McCluskey. Not exactly a revolutionary figure, you might say, and you would be right. But they were very keen to get good old Len back in place again in his amazing strategy to take over the Labour Party for socialism. I'm not sure how that went. Maybe somebody can tell us in the Q&A. But it did get Len a publishing deal and his book of poetry out there, so he got that out of it. But the point is that this happens every single time with the Trotskyite organizations. Big revolutionary language, a lot of talk, get a few activists around you, then back a candidate for the general secretaryship that will do what? They will say, well, it will allow space for the left to operate in the union. What they mean is there will be more space for them to operate in the union. And another group in Britain that is notorious, the Socialist Workers' Party, who of course have been fractured by numerous sex scandals and various other things that have taken place over the last few years, but they still, to this day, are able to operate as the TUC's subcontractor for anti-racism. They've done this for years, going back to the days of the Anti-Nazi League, Unite Against Fascism, which had such luminaries as David Cameron signing up to its founding statement. And now, yes, now Stand Up to Racism. Again, same thing over and over again. And the TUC pays for that union, for that organization to function. Now, just to digress slightly into what these organizations do, and I will pose this question to comrades as an open one. How can you have an anti-racist organization that is supported by cabinet ministers from the Conservative Party? David Cameron signed Unite Against Fascism's founding statement. The man who gave the world the Libyan war, where there was, if you're not aware of it, one of its byproducts was the reintroduction of slavery into Libya. That man signed the Unite Against Fascism founding statement. How serious do you think he is about opposing racism? Because I don't think his commitment is particularly strong on that. But apparently the Socialist Workers' Party thought that was a great idea to bring him on board. They also platform routinely Labour Party MPs, not just Labour left MPs either. Stand Up to Racism, I think it was about 7 years ago, in a march in London, had David Lammy as their keynote speaker, the man who is now Foreign Secretary.
He's black, he must be anti-racist.
Of course, you know.
Like Netanyahu and Zelensky, who he's very keen on.
Yes.
Yeah, and he knows what is imperialism.
He knows imperialism, he knows he likes it. He likes expenses as well. The point is, if you'll have these people who are not just veiled supporters of imperialism, but open supporters of imperialism, supposedly standing to speak about anti-racism, when racism in Britain comes from the bourgeois, it comes out of the imperialist system. It's promoted in the working class by all of the major political parties, and yet you're going to have them on a platform saying stand up to racism? Now, that makes no sense, unless, of course, you're not serious about actually tackling racism. What you're serious about is actually looking as if you are and getting a bunch of your full-timers a nice little gig paid for by the TUC, which is actually what it was really all about. And it's about, really, as Joti was saying, manipulating the positive impulses that workers have, wanting to actually make a stand against racism in this case, or in the case like the fake, what's referred to as rank and fileism of the Trotskyites, the idea that this very militant sounding language about workers must drive the unions. And a lot of angry workers who have heartily pissed off with the way that the trade union leaders conduct themselves will see that language and think, yes, I want to get involved with that. They don't want to go near the corpse of the Communist Party of Britain because its remnants are a party for trade union bureaucrats. So they might get attracted towards something which speaks the language of revolution, which speaks the language of workers' control, but in actual fact is there to lead you in a circle. This is the way it always goes. They lead workers in with a lot of militant language, and then what you find is it's the same methods of Trotsky himself employed inside the party itself, which are internally, they are always dictatorially run organizations. When I was a member of the Socialist Party, we had to engage in a 4-week fight with the regional full-timer just to see the party's rules. And this is when we were going to be delegates to a conference, you know? Now, just as a contrast to our party, it's one of the first things you're given is the party rules and program, and you're encouraged to study it. After 4 weeks of battling this guy, he finally gave us like a badly photocopied version of the party rules, very grudgingly, because they didn't want you to know them. It's like the reason why they don't have like study groups. They don't want you to read. They don't want you even to read Lenin. These days, I don't think they even get you to read Trotsky. You know? But the point is, it's this very top-down dictatorial control where the line comes from the leadership, usually in London. No offence. And then it is told to the members, and you're told to go off and do it. Contrast that to how a Leninist organisation is supposed to work, how our party does work, which is that the leadership obviously has its role in debating and discussing a particular line to take out, but the comrades have to go and test that in practice amongst the masses. And if it's not working amongst the masses, you have to feed back to the leadership and let them know, well, what is working and what isn't. And it's a constant reinforcing relationship between the base of the party and the party leadership that has to remain in unity with each other. It is the proper application of the dialectical method to questions of organisation. Whereas the Trotskyites, it's all one way. It's like, right, the great leaders in London have decided that we will go out now and we will promote, I don't know, Len McCluskey for Unite Leadership. There will be no discussion. It has now been decided that our beloved trade union comrades are now beyond criticism. There can be no discussion. And I mention that because it comes from a very specific point, because we reached a point where Socialist Party control inside PCS was getting shaky because it was obvious to anybody in the Socialist Party's ranks, and there were people in there who wanted to be revolutionaries, but most of those left the party in the end. It became obvious that the people in the hierarchy of the trade union group in my union were not only not revolutionaries, they were barely even socialists. These were people who had joined because either their friends were in it, or they joined because it was a way to get a position in the union. And what happened was, because they'd been at the top of the union for so long, they were seen by the Socialist Party, and again, all the Trotskyite groups do this, as being beyond criticism. They weren't supposed to improve themselves as Marxists. They weren't supposed to act like Marxists. They weren't supposed to advocate for even the Marxism that the party was supposed to represent. They were just there to occupy positions, and they were there to make sure that those positions weren't occupied by any other faction. And it didn't matter what else they did, as long as they still kept turning up to the right conferences, they could still be there. And what it did in the end was create a privilege layer that was positively anti-socialist in its politics, but was still nominally members of a supposedly revolutionary organisation. And that is what not just that party does, it's what they all do. It's what and again, it's a failure that goes even beyond Trotskyism into the wider left in Britain, which is because they all base themselves so much on what Lenin and Stalin referred to as like the labor aristocracy, because they root themselves in the trade union bureaucracy and in the more privileged layers of the working class. They are very opposed to the actual empowerment and education of the workers themselves. They are in favor of defending small cliques that run everything, and that is how they conduct themselves in the trade union movement. Now, just to broaden this out slightly, how they conduct themselves in the trade union movement is, of course, completely in line with how they conduct themselves everywhere else. Many of you in this hall will have been through the ranks of the Stop the War Coalition. 20 years, no wars stopped. Don't let that discourage you. The point about it is, though, that the SWP, being the most prominent Trotskyite group in that originally, have dominated it along with the Labour left from the very beginning, and have steered it firmly in what I would call a woolly pacifist direction. Deliberately avoiding, as Joti said, questions of imperialism, never explaining for a moment why the British ruling class want to go and invade Iraq, never explaining for a moment why the aggression towards Afghanistan, never explaining why, really, there was a 20-year occupation of Afghanistan. And then when it came to the wars in Libya and Syria, actually repeating the propaganda of the ruling class. And I can speak to this and testify to it personally, because when the war in Libya broke out, the Socialist Party leadership put out whole articles in their magazines and their paper saying, well, essentially agreeing with every point of propaganda that the imperialists put out about the government led by Muammar al-Gaddafi. Every single one. But at the end of the article, it said, oh, but we don't want them to be bombed. But they've just done the work in the rest of the article of agreeing with every point that the US and the British imperialists made. All lies, manifest lies. And so, what effect do we think that that has? Now, bitterly ironic thing, when they printed that in their magazine, one of their own comrades, I believe he was from their Derby branch, wrote in to say, well, why are we in favor of the war then? Because you've just spent 3 pages in the theoretical journal saying that Gaddafi is this monster. So why are we opposing the war? And this caused consternation. Because one of the things that they need to do is they need to still pretend that they're a revolutionary force. Now, there are some Trotskyites in Britain, the AWL being the most prominent of them, who are rooted in the Labour Party. That's the Alliance for Workers' Liberty, or the Alliance of White Liberals, or the Alliance of Woolly Liberals, depending upon which language you want to use, headquartered in NATO. They are openly rabid imperialists. If you ever have the misfortune to run into one, they'll start screaming in your face about the need to defeat Putin or something like that. 10 years ago, it was about the need to defeat Assad. They're quite useful because they're the most obvious and logical extension of Trotsky's own beliefs, which is you just openly back imperialism, which is what a lot of the American Trotskyites ended up doing in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, up to this day. They were so rabidly anti-Soviet, so rabidly anti-communist, that some of them, led by a guy called Max Shachtman, who was Trotsky's secretary, ended up advocating for the US side in the Vietnam War. They're quite openly. And they continue to do similar things to this day. I mean, one of the big organizations in the United States that's come to prominence in the last decade is this repulsive entity called the Democratic Socialists of America, founded by a guy called Michael Harrington, who came out of the Max Shachtman tradition. Now, what do? They got a big glossy publication. They got a lot of books printed. They're attached to a publishing house. All this costs an awful lot of money. One might wonder where they get it. But one of the things they do is this left washing of imperialism consistently, over and over again. Every time a big piece of aggression comes up from the US imperialists, be it Libya, be it Syria, or these days in Ukraine, or over Palestine itself, that's a little bit more difficult for them to do given the crimes of US imperialism and its Israeli proxy are so egregious. They will be there saying that those who are actually doing the fighting against imperialism, those who are being attacked by imperialism, they're as bad a set of villains, if not worse, than the imperialists. Same trick over and over again. I'm old enough to remember the Kosovo War, 1999, where the Trotskyites in Britain and in the United States were openly saying that Milosevic is a red-brown fascist, the KLA are freedom fighters. Well, of course, we know.
So does Joti Brar. So,
but it's horseshoe theory again. What you found, though, when you, of course, investigated the KLA for more than 5 minutes, was that this was an MI6 CIA-run operation staffed by fascists and aided by long-time close collaborators with the CIA, Al-Qaeda, who were, of course, in Kosovo. They were in Bosnia. They were there working with their friends in American intelligence. And you didn't need to dig too far to get into this, but the Trotskyites largely can't be bothered. They just say, oh, well, this must be a liberatory force because Milosevic bad, Stalinist, bureaucratic blur, therefore must be bad, but don't do the bombing. So they're doing the heavy lifting for imperialism and ducking out at the last minute is what most of them do. And that's their method when it comes to questions of war. They never make it clear to their own members or the wider audience that they get access to through organizations like the Stop the War Coalition. They never make it clear what the nature of imperialism is, what the nature of US imperialism is, what the nature of British imperialism is, and they never break it down as to, well, what is this alliance? Why are the British ruling class hooked up to the US imperialists? What do they have in common? What are the contradictions between them? You would think that that would be an education you'd want to give your membership. Certainly it's what our party does now and always has done. But no, because they don't want their members to actually become properly educated Marxist cadres What they want is a group of energetic students who will run around university campuses very energetically for about 18 months, drop out, and then they'll recruit some new ones. That's how they work. And this complete grotesque deception that they have engaged in for many, many years has to be renewed every few years, as Joti says. And they do this by making sure that nobody in their organization has this historical memory that lasts more than 5 minutes. Now, just to talk briefly about the Ukraine question, this is another area where the Trotskyites get caught out badly, because it reveals their utter cluelessness or their deceptive nature when they come to write about the Russian state as it is currently constituted. Now, you don't need to tell us that the Russian state is based on the foundations of Russian capitalism. We know that. But what we do also know is that the Russian state has evolved to the point where it is now in an open clash with US imperialism. And you don't need to be an expert on imperialism to know that the Russian state as it currently exists is not an imperialist power. But what you'll find in the Trotskyite so-called analysis of the Ukraine war is a deliberate obfuscation at best, or outright lies at worst. They will say, oh, Putin's a gangster capitalist. What the hell does that mean? Is it the same as gangster rap? Maybe it is. But the point about it is that they obfuscate the question. The question should be like, well, why is it that US imperialism has spent at least 30 years running fascist organizations in Ukraine? Why have they been investing so heavily in that? Why have they backed at least 2 coups, possibly 3, inside Ukraine? Why have they multiple occasions to rig elections? And that can only lead you, once you start investigating that question, to the conclusion that this is, whilst it is partially about Ukraine's natural resources, it is about the much bigger prize, which is, of course, the entirety of Russia. Ukraine is the gateway through which imperialism will seek to destroy the territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence of the Russian Federation. Now, of course, the Trotskyites won't tell you that. They'll tell you it's a clash of 2 imperialisms, or a clash between imperialism and Putin the gangster, or something like that. And again, this is an absolutely crucial question to understand, especially when you have the entire British ruling class and all of its political servants and all of its media and all of its academic friends all lined up behind the idea that they're backing Ukraine. There's no dissension on it. No dissension allowed on it. This tells you how important it is for British imperialism that absolutely no dissension must be allowed. And the Trotskyites are there laundering the reputation of imperialism by completely mischaracterizing the Russian state as a result. And again, this goes back right the way to Trotsky himself. Trotsky himself, before World War II, and this is one of the things that his followers were accused of in the Moscow trials, was collaboration with the OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, which is still around in its modern form to this day. And they were accused of collaborating with them and plotting to, of course, separate Ukraine from the USSR. Well, who wrote several articles in the late 1930s calling for the separation of Ukraine from the USSR? It was Leon Trotsky. I'm not making this up. You can go and check it. Go online now. Go on the Marxist Internet Archive. They're all there. Trotsky openly calling in the late 1930s for the separation of Ukraine from the USSR and echoing the lies about the Holodomor and the evils of Stalin starving the Ukrainians to death, etc., etc. Now, why on earth would Trotsky be doing that in 1938 to 1939? Ask the question. Who else had some ambitions in Ukraine around about that time? Don't answer. And when I first started reading about Trotsky's true activities in the 1930s, I dismissed it, thinking, this is all just made up. But once you delve into it, and you start to find that Trotsky's books were published in fascist Italy, when every other communist, Lenin, Stalin, everybody associated with the Comintern, all their works were banned. The entire leadership of the Italian Communist Party was thrown in jail. Antonio Gramsci died in jail. The entire leadership of the KPD, German Communist Party, thrown in jail, all of their works banned. What was on Hitler's bedside reading table? It's Trotsky's autobiography. Apparently he used to read it quite intensely. He was convinced by its arguments. Well, the old failed watercolor artist should have used better sources for his invasion of the Soviet Union, because it turns out that Trotsky was not only completely full of it, he was giving even a completely false impression to his new friends in the German Nazis. Because if you read Hitler on when he's making these raving speeches, he uses this line: "If you kick the door in, the entire rotten fortress will collapse." He says this over and over again. Now, that's a phrase he takes from Trotsky. So he's clearly not only read Trotsky once, he's really absorbed it. And Mussolini was also apparently a careful reader of Trotsky. It's one of the reasons why their calculations about the USSR was so wrong. But this, as Joti's been saying and as the pamphlet will make clear, this is the reason why they keep Trotskyism around. It's quite notable that in areas of the world that have been subject to the most harsh and brutal conditions imposed by US, British, French, German imperialism, Trotskyism doesn't really take root. There's no real time for spending ages doing academic noodling or to start shouting and screaming about how we can't possibly do a revolution here. We have to wait for the imperialist countries to have a revolution, then they might let us have one. Great message that, isn't it? But the central reason why, of course, even in Russia, the area, the land of his birth, Trotsky's largely forgotten. It's largely forgotten by the Russian masses. He's of no relevance to them. The only people who uphold the legacy of Trotsky inside the Russian Federation now are people who are in favor of the NATO side, who actually go out and demonstrate against the war in Ukraine. And that's who the Trotskyites have attracted inside Russia. So to bring my remarks to a close and leave plenty of time for question and comment, the role that Trotskyism plays inside the British working class movement is not only a counter-revolutionary one, it is one that is actively designed to mislead and miseducate and demoralize. Because many people, and I like to count myself as being one of them, go into it thinking you're looking for a revolutionary solution. You're looking for a way to actually get out of what you see and correctly identify as the complete dead end of bourgeois politics, as the complete dead end of conventional trade unionism. But what you find instead is something which talks left and acts bureaucratically, dictatorially, which does not educate workers, which misleads workers, which seeks to draw them into what can only be described as a cult-like organizations, consisting of people whose job it is not to become educated cadres, but to become thoughtless followers of tiny bureaucratic cliques who are embedded within the hierarchy of the trade union movement and of academia. And you don't get to be embedded with those types of institutions, comrades, unless you're, of course, doing a very good service for the British ruling class, which is what Trotskyism in Britain does. It's what Trotskyism in the United States does with regard to American imperialism. It is the left face of imperialism. It is a dangerous and pernicious trend within the working class movement. It has, or should have, no place within it. And the quicker it can be disposed of, the better off the working class will be. Thank you, comrades.
I bent me to that bidding, my spirit of each selfish plan and cruel passion ridding. For thus I hoped someday to aid, oh can such hope be vain, when my dear country shall be made a nation once again. A nation once again, a nation once again.